We're going to get started now. I'm Jason Judd. I'm the Executive Director of the New Conversations Project at Cornell University. We are a research center in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and our focus is labor governance in global supply chains. We're interested in what data and data analyses tell us about what's happening out there and what works to improve working conditions, protection of labor rights on a large scale. And we've written, as part of that, we've written a paper published in July called Repeat, Regain, or Renegotiate, and it's a look at the future, possible futures of the global apparel industry. And the paper, we're going to run through it today, but it's really just a prompt to get four interesting people together to talk about the findings in the paper, to get their reactions to it, and hear from them about where they think in the post-COVID era the industry's headed. So let's start by asking them to introduce themselves, and then we'll have a quick run through of the agenda for today's session. Anannya, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody, good morning, good evening. Thank you to Cornell for organizing this event and to Jason for all his wonderful work. I'm Anannya Bhattacharjee, I'm based in India. I'm the International Coordinator of Asia Floorwage Alliance, which is an Asian-led international labor alliance that works on issues related to global supply chain, in particular the garment sector, on living wages, on gender-based violence and harassment and freedom of association. I'm also the president of Garment and Allied Workers Union, which is in north of India. Thank you.
Okay, Arianna.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, for being here. My name is Arianna Rossi. I work for the ILO IFC Better Work program. I'm based in Geneva. Better Work is a program that aims to improve working conditions while promoting competitiveness in the global garment industry. I'm not a neutral party in this conversation because I've actually worked very closely with Jason and his team on producing this paper and worked together on a brief, as well with my colleagues in the Decent Work in Global Supply Chains Asia program and a regional economic and social analysis unit in Bangkok. So we feel we are very much among friends, and I look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Arianna. Cara.
Hi, everyone. I am so honored to be here today, and thank you, Jason, for inviting me. And congratulations to Jason and Arianna on the paper. It was very, very comprehensive and helpful. My name is Cara Chacon, and I've been working in the CSR industry for, 24 years now, since 1998. And I most recently was at Patagonia for 11 years. It was an amazing run, and I was leading their social and environmental responsibility efforts. And I've been on a break for the last few months. It has been wonderful. And I just started my own consulting business called Intentum Corporate Responsibility Consulting. And I really look forward to talking about this paper and shedding more light on some of these issues that are affecting worker well-being. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Cara. Maureen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maureen Chelsea. I'm a senior program manager with Laudes Foundation. And yeah, like Cara, I've been in this industry for a while now, about 20 plus years. So it's been a while, and I think, it's just an honor and a privilege to be in this wonderful panel of amazing, powerful voices, and especially that's always helpful. And I think that in a sea of webinars, this paper comes in as a refreshing change where we have an opportunity to hit the reset button. And what does that mean for each and every one of us who are part of this session today? So thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. And thank you to all four of you for joining us. So I thought we'd take a quick look at the agenda, where we're going to go in the next 75 minutes. or so, and then I'll take us on a dash through the main findings in the paper. I'll talk first about the origins, why we wrote the paper, and then the themes, the key findings. We'll get reactions then from panelists to what's in the paper, what's interesting, what's controversial, what they'd like to argue about, see more of, and then a round of questions from me. We'll look back at the scenarios. We'll have a quick poll for everyone, panelists and audience, and then we'll have a final round of questions, and we'll take questions from the floor using the Q&A function. Okay. So the origins of this paper, as Arianna said, we at the New Conversations Project at Cornell and the team at the ILO, we're thinking together, arguing about what the future of the apparel industry might be. And for our part, we were frustrated with the short-term reporting about the COVID crisis and the hot takes on the impact that this pandemic was going to have on workers, on suppliers, on buyers, consumers. And we were determined to take a longer view, and the ILO was willing to support that, both in terms of funding and in shaping up and reviewing the paper. And as we started to look ahead, the co-authors of this paper, it's myself and Lowell Jackson, who's since left Cornell to work for the State Department. He and I were arguing about what the future might hold, and realized we didn't know nearly enough about the industry's past. And inspired by the work of Sarosh Kuruvilla, who's the academic director for the New Conversations Project, we wanted to look back over the last 20, 30 years of private regulation and public regulation of work in apparel supply chain. And we realized as we look back that there were lots of snapshots, but that we didn't have the time series that we needed on really key questions like what are the changes in sourcing patterns over the last 20, 30 years? What's happening with major players in the industry? Who are they, and how does the makeup of the top players, buyers, suppliers, how is that changing? So we went after data that could answer those questions for us. And the thinking was we needed to be able to look at the long trajectories of change or stasis in the industry if we were going to make smart guesses about where it might be headed. And then we started writing. We organized and analyzed data on 4 or 5 of these big questions. And what I'll do over the next few minutes is share with you just a handful of slides using graphs, things that words really can't describe, to give you a sense of what was happening, what's been happening over the last 20, 30 years on several fronts. First, the shape of the market, who are the big players and how is their makeup changing. That's shorthand for that is market concentration and consolidation. Second, we'll take a look at shifting sourcing patterns. Third, we'll look at the impact of climate breakdown. And then fourth, we'll sort of roll all that up and ask how do those big changes affect workers in particular? And we'll look at the tension between growing automation and employment levels, and then we'll end with a look at regulation, public and private, and then we'll have our argument about what it all means. So let me share with you just a handful of slides. Okay, first, concentration and consolidation. We were interested, as I said, in the big players in the industry. Who were they? How was that makeup changing over time? What share of the global apparel trade did they control? And what we found in the graph on the left is that in orange, apparel, blue, footwear, is that there was growth in market concentration. The top 10 buyers and retailers of apparel globally saw their share of the global trade ticking up over time, not radically, but over the last 10 years, certainly growing. And that's their overall share, which grew from about 8.8% to 11.5% or so by 2019, doesn't suggest market dominance by this top 10, but it's moving slowly in that direction. It doesn't compare, for example, with eyeglass frames or social media platforms, but it is concentration amongst these giants is growing, not shrinking. Contrast that with footwear, which is moving upward, same trajectory, but footwear concentration in the footwear market is growing impressively from about 19% a decade ago to about 29% today. And then we took a look at what was changing in the supply base of these major buyers. And this we call consolidation. It's the long-term shift, really over the last 15 years, from large, diversified supply bases to a relative handful of suppliers serving a relative handful of buyers. And we used as an example 4 of the major brands, a mix of US and European brands, to show that shift over time. Nike and Adidas are the most radical examples. Nike's supply base has effectively halved over the last decade, as has Adidas. Gap's is shrinking, but at a slower rate, and Puma at the slowest rate yet. But the trend is clear. All of these brands are consolidating their supplier base, working with ever fewer factories and ever fewer partners. Now, we all knew this. People, including our panelists who work in the industry, have seen this or felt this over time, but we felt it was important to organize the data and to be able to show the change over the last couple of decades. Second in the paper, we took a look at sourcing patterns and how they've changed over the last 20 years. And the big story in the first decade was the explosive growth of apparel production in China. These two graphs, the one on the left is imports or share of imports to the US over the last 20 years, and on the right to the European Union. The mix of countries is a little bit different, but in both imports to the US and the European Union, China still dominates, but reached its peak, about 50% in both of those markets around 2010, and has been slowly but steadily declining in the years since. So the big shift in the last decade has been movement away from China, from about 50% in 2010 in both those markets to about 36-37% in both of those markets in 2019. In the paper, you'll see a table that shows the shift over time and also shows you how the work that's leaving China is getting picked up in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. We then took a turn in the paper. We were interested in how sourcing patterns were changing. And as you saw on the last slide, we see work moving to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. And we were reading, Lowell and I, as we were getting ready to write this paper, reading in the literature, both academic and popular, and the frameworks that the industry is using to talk about itself. Circularity, regenerative, et cetera, were major themes. And we began to wonder what that looked like at the production end. Apart from tracking things like greenhouse gas emissions, we wondered what would happen as sea levels rise and heat increases in these major production centers. So we did what turned out to be a relatively straightforward integration of two maps. We took from Climate Central, which is a clearinghouse for data on climate breakdown and climate change. We took their projected sea level change maps, and we laid on top of them data from the Open Apparel Registry, which tracks tracks production of apparel around the world. So by integrating these two maps, these two data sets, we were able to see what will happen in the coming decade by 2030 to apparel production in half a dozen places. And I put on the screen here just three of the more dramatic ones. Dhaka, Guangzhou in China, and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam all see significant shares of their apparel production underwater, not permanently, but underwater in the annual floods. This doesn't account for storms. It doesn't account for rainfall and inland flooding. And this is based on our RCP 8.5, which is one of the more threatening or worst scenarios for climate breakdown. So you can adjust your assumptions and get slightly different results, but the bottom line is the same. Significant portions of apparel production in these places will be regularly underwater. And in the paper, in the interviews, we put this question to buyers, suppliers, union leaders, and others, and discovered that it really wasn't yet on the radar. We think there are a number of reasons for that. Maybe we can get to them when we take this up with the panelists. But these are places where rising sea levels are going to threaten production, bad for workers, bad for suppliers. The question that we can take up in the round with the panelists is, what does this mean for buyers? What's their obligation? How will they react to this? Okay, what does this mean for workers? Well, lots of things, and as you make your way through the paper, you'll see that we pull out lots of possible implications for workers, their families, suppliers, and their governments. But using the data, we wanted to focus on technology, and it's a little hard to pin down the growth of use of technology or automation in apparel. Easier in footwear, easier to see. And we pulled a couple of data sets to give us a sense of what might be happening in the coming years by looking back over the last 20. That graph on the left shows gross value added per worker. This is a rough but ready measure of changes in productivity over time. So we pulled that data for a handful of countries, apparel and footwear production countries, and ran them over the last couple of decades. That blue line that's increasing impressively in the graph on the left is China. And it shows growing value added per worker from the same neighborhood in 2001. Everyone's gathered there at about $1,500 US to about $14,000 today. That's a function of a number of things: growing skill sets amongst workers, improvements in process, but also, importantly, changes in technology. And you can see the other lines slowly ticking up. Vietnam and Indonesia are working their way towards $3,000 and $4,000 in that average GVA measure, but nowhere close to the levels that the Chinese industry has reached. What we think that means is that these changes in process and technology and the growth of skills are going to follow the work. So we can expect to see those lines increase, that their rate of increase will increase in the years to come. On the right, we wondered what it would mean as these improvements in process and skills, and importantly, technology, take hold in these other markets. That is, all of the production centers except China. And we graphed in blue there the export value, total exports of apparel, footwear, and textile for the Asia Pacific, excluding China. You see that increasing impressively over the last 20 years. That's not a surprise. And then we graphed against that apparel employment. We were interested in seeing, as exports grew, what was happening to employment. Did it grow at the same rate? Well, you can see that it didn't, and they cross over here somewhere around 2017, 2018. And that orange line flattens considerably after 2014, 2015. What this suggests, what this means to us, is that even as exports increase, as these industries grow, the number of jobs generated by the growth in exports is slowing. And at some point, you're gonna have policymakers asking themselves, is it worth the investment that we're making or the concessions that we're providing to suppliers and buyers to create these apparel industry jobs, given that because of improvements in process, skills, and technologies, they're no longer the engine of growth they once were. Okay, last slide. In the last analysis in the paper, we look at public and private regulation. By private regulation, we mean sort of brand collaboration on their own or through multi-stakeholder initiatives, rules written by brands and retailers for their suppliers and indirectly workers who make the products, and public regulation, rules written and sometimes enforced by national governments, either where the products are made or where they're sold, chiefly in the US and the European Union. So we were in looking at the progress over the last 20 years. These slides come from Sarosh Kuruvila's recent book, published in April, on the impacts of private regulation over the last 20 years. We looked at data from a global audit firm. And you see in red, that dotted line in red in the graph on the left shows the number of audits or the number of findings, the number of labor violations per audit by country, and what you'd expect to see over 20 years of intensive CSR attention to these suppliers is a big decline in that red line. But in fact, you see it ticking up and then ticking down, and on the whole, it hasn't moved at all over the last 7-8 years. The data that was available to us from the audit firm only covered these 6 or 7 years. If you look on the right, you can compare apparel, which is picked out with the arrow there, against other industries, but the red dotted line is the same. It goes up, it goes down, but over 6 or 7 years, it doesn't go anywhere. What this means is that that private regulation of apparel production is not producing significant improvements. This is important for regulators, whether public or private. Private, if you're watching a program trying to determine what's working and what's not, you have to be able to see the big picture and determine what sort of changes you need to improve working conditions over time. If you're a public regulator in the European Union contemplating the new due diligence directive, you have to wonder where meaningful data will come from that will allow you to track progress and pick out stars and pick out laggards. At present, this kind of data that shows progress or lack of progress over time isn't widely available. The importance of data, access to data for researchers like me, to regulators, to others who are inside and outside the industry, is hard to overstate. The apparel industry is famously opaque, and as researchers, we struggle to get hold of data sets that will help us see what's really happening inside. Okay, so that was a quick tour of major findings in the paper based on data that we were able to analyze. There's a whole lot more in the paper based on interviews and anecdote, but we're focused here on what the data is able to tell us about what's been happening in apparel and footwear over the last 20 years. I've asked each of the panelists to pick out 1 or 2 of these themes and react to it. What's interesting, what's confusion, what's challenging, and let's get to it. Anannya.
Yeah, thanks for the brief presentation. Of course, it's a very rich report. I really enjoyed going through it and all the different aspects. I find the phenomenon of consolidation that you have taken up very interesting. As you say, it's a trend that we have all known about for some time, and but you point it out, your report points it out in a much more, with much more backing and facts and so on, and also projection going forward. In my opinion, consolidation provides a great opportunity. because what essentially consolidation means is a stability of relationships between entities. And this really helps to build an environment of standards, mutual benefits, and this, if translated also to labor, not just the buyer and the supplier, but also labor stability, reducing turnover through better standards. The overall consolidation is always good for business. And this is something that the consolidation that is good for business is something that the brands and the suppliers are coming to on their own. But I think this understanding has not yet gone to the point of seeing labor, the labor that is being employed, its stability, a standard, and a sense of mutual benefit emerging from there. That has not yet happened. And that is the full picture that we have to see of brands, suppliers, and labor, all three in a relationship of stability, mutual benefit, and good practices. So in my opinion, that's a good phenomenon. The other one that you have talked about is automation. More than automation, I would really go into the technological changes that are required for a good business. And what we have found often is that those companies that have the ability to take technology in a good way into their business and incorporate technological change also tend to be the ones that are more open to maintaining higher standards. And in the sense that the low road practices, which can be either technology or bad labor practices, are really not a good business model. So really, in order to be successful, smart use of technology as well as good labor standards go hand in hand. And this is what we have found. And the third point and the last point I would like to make is on the word of private regulation, where you have shown something that is well understood today, is that audits, the way they work, and the voluntary world of private regulation doesn't work, which is why the European Union is working on due diligence legislation, which is why from Asia Floor Wage Alliance also we are exploring production country litigation mechanisms through the concept of joint employer liability, which we started doing this year. But the point of it is that the point is not really the privateness of the regulation. Yes, it is best to have legislated public regulation, but if it is a private deal, then we need agreements which bind together private parties into a commitment, into co-enforcement, into sharing of risks. So so to me, the issue is really the way the regulation happens. Are we bound together in a mutual commitment for co-enforcement and sharing of risks? I think my time is probably up, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, that was good, and we'll come back to that. Arianna?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to summarize reactions to this very comprehensive and the kind of wide-ranging analysis. So I wanted to pick an angle to it, and I chose gender and gender equality as my angle because I think it's so relevant to this industry. And I think when we think about the impact on workers, which you have explained now, and it's very much detailed in the paper, there is this underlining remark to be had that not all workers are the same, and of course not just depending on gender, but also depending on their status and their different intersectionalities, and their level of vulnerability really comes into the picture because of that. And I think when we look at the trends that you have highlighted, and also Anannya has just mentioned on technological change and consolidation, these can be opportunities, but they need to be harnessed with policy measures to make sure that they also benefit the most vulnerable workers, and they tend to be often young women, migrant women in the global garment industry. So I think it's very important to be proactive from a policy perspective and not assume that things will fall into place for every worker, even if the right decisions are taken. And I think this also spills into the discussion around regulation and transparency and data availability, which is one of the points you make in the report. That is, and also you just made, that it's very hard to make this type of analysis because data is sometimes hard to access. And I say it from the point of view of an organization that collects a lot of data, and it's a bit of a also recognition of how hard it is, and how hard it is to be the custodian of this information and making sure it is shared in a confidential way, but giving access to the right actors and the right channels to ensure it can become evidence that feeds into the debate. And I think, again, gender is really important here, because very often, especially public regulations, but I think, I can take a bit of also self-criticism here. Across the board, we can do more in terms of collecting more gender disaggregated data and data that can inform gender inclusive policies. So I think that's just something that resonates to me very much in this analysis when we look, especially when we look forward at the scenarios and what is the future we would like. So not just what is the inevitable future or next steps that we see, but more like really feeling that we can be parts of the solutions with each of our entry points and our contributions to this becoming a more equitable industry.
Good. Thank you, Arianna. There was just a tangent here. There was a planned part of the paper. We would look at gender disaggregated wage data in apparel, but what's available is too spotty. We had to give it up, but maybe for the next round. Okay, Cara.
Okay, so I have two comments. One's on the paper overall, and one is on climate shocks, including the sea level rise that is mentioned in the paper. And on the first point overall, the paper really helped me see the various moving parts in the industry on the business side, on climate, on gender, responsible sourcing, legislation. It's a great paper. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. And it got me thinking that, what I've seen in the industry over the past few decades, and spending a lot of time in factories and speaking to workers and suppliers and auditors that are in the industry, and seeing the conditions of workers. All of us, and certainly myself, I can speak for myself for sure, is that I have never seen the unprecedented amount of challenges that we are all facing in the past. In the past 10 years for sure, in the past 3 years, even more so because of COVID, I feel like we're all scrambling to deal with these issues, and not just CSR teams, but the product teams and the sourcing teams and the buyers and the forecasters. I've seen it firsthand that change is accelerating. And all this is greatly affecting worker well-being, and we're not able to get a handle on what's happening in a holistic way. And I'm not a pessimist, I'm actually an optimist, but this really seems like the new normal. And that with climate change, we are going to be seeing even more shocks to the system. And as I was reading this paper, I was like, okay, what can we do to solve for this issue, And, I think the no-brainer, answer there is we need a holistic approach. We need to move from being reactive to proactive. And this may seem very simple, but if you look at the history of our industry, everything is piecemealed in terms of disaster planning. And we look at Rana Plaza. I remember, everyone scrambling to do, building inspections and, around the world after that. And it's just so reactive. So we just can't do that anymore. And this paper makes you very aware that there's this acceleration of serious problems. So that was my one thought. And this is also a no-brainer, but, the industry has to come together and we have to figure out how we can raise awareness of this and fit the climate issue in there that, crisscrosses with human rights and labor and conditions. And my other thought too was, and I did a little research before this panel on what are governments and sourcing countries doing to mitigate climate issues, and there's not a lot of information out there, but government is key in terms of this potential collaboration that we all need to think about, at least as one piece of the puzzle. So, and I had some other thoughts on that, but there's not enough time, and so I wanted to jump into the climate change and have some specific thoughts on that issue. And this really is the topic why I wanted to join the panel. One of the main reasons is, I'm very interested in this intersection between climate shocks and workers in the apparel supply chain and other supply chains as well. And, the WRI, just to kind of punch what the paper says, it states that sea level rise is faster than any prior century for the past 3,000 years. And if you're kind of a nerd like me, I'm reading, even on my break, I was reading articles on sea level rise and how that is, it's in mainstream news now. Whereas even 2 years ago, you were barely seeing anything. But this is happening, and it is happening in sourcing countries. And I'll talk about Vietnam in a second as an example, but I also wanted to, if you're not studying this issue yet, all of us are just jumping in. This is the beginning. And I wanted to say it's not just sea level rise and heat, extreme heat, but it's also extreme weather events and more frequent extreme weather events. Food security, including affordability of food. The price of food has increased over the last few years. Water scarcity and scarcity of other resources, air quality, and loss of work and wages because workers out of work temporarily or permanently because of climate shocks. So it's a much broader issue that needs to be studied. And so in my field of experience and speaking to workers and factory owners, I have found that there are not enough research studies. There is very little awareness of climate shock issues in the supply chain and how they're affecting workers. And most suppliers are not doing anything around climate, which is sort of understandable right now because everyone's just trying to survive through COVID. But there are two small exceptions to this rule that I'm seeing. And one is I am seeing factories stepping up in terms of their policies and procedures on preventing heat stress when the temperatures get over that 90-degree Fahrenheit mark, 32 degrees Celsius. So I am seeing that. And the second thing I am seeing is that suppliers are really starting to work on reducing their carbon emissions and transitioning to clean energy. So those are two things I say are exception to the rule. But in terms of sea level rise, extreme weather events, all these other things, there's very little being done. I have seen some suppliers think about an individual financial aid account that workers can draw on, whether they're out of work temporarily, being laid off due to COVID and other shocks. So some suppliers are thinking about that. And also some of the fair trade certified factories are using that fair trade premium to cover that. So that is kind of a ray of hope. And then what we do know is really just broad strokes, you guys. It's just broad information on this topic. It's like country level data. So it's not even down to the manufacturing level and down to the worker level on climate shocks. It's just the research isn't there. And in fact, I just read an article on CNN yesterday that out of 100,000 climate studies, these are recent climate studies, scientists recently reviewed them through a computer algorithm. I don't know if you guys saw this article yesterday, but there was almost no information on climate shocks that are happening in the global south. And this is where most sourcing countries are located. And we know that no country is immune to the climate shock. So it's happening there. And then I also wanted to read a couple statistics from the 2021 World Bank report that was actually really interesting on this topic. And it said by 2050, more than 200 million people in 6 regions, all these regions were in the global south, by the way, could move within their country due to climate change. And it also said that by 2030, countries could see an emergence of climate migration hotspots as early as 2030, and that is only 8 years away. And finally, it said the main drivers for climate migration are water stress, drops in crop productivity, and sea level rise. So it's very, very, I think, helpful for this paper to cite sea level rise as an issue that the apparel industry, both on the business side and on the human rights side, needs to address, and quickly. And then I'll just have a few closing remarks here on Vietnam. I really studied Vietnam because it's where everyone's moved their garment factories. Pretty much everyone has been moving out of China, as the paper also cited. And my initial research, I was quite surprised to find out, and there's not that much information, is that Vietnam actually has been preparing for climate shock since the early 90s. And but it's mainly in the agriculture industry, at least what I've read, and there definitely needs to be a deeper dive. But in the Mekong Delta, which is near Ho Chi Minh City, the rice growers are already in jeopardy because of seawater intrusion into their rice paddies, and it is destroying their crops. And a lot of people have already migrated out of that area. So it's the maps that are in this paper are very accurate, I think, and that there is an issue that manufacturers in the south of Vietnam, actually in the north too, there's issues that they need to look at that. And so just in closing, I wanted to say this is not just a brand issue. It's not just a supplier issue. It's one that we just can't solve alone. This is something that we are going to need to collaborate and do more research and find solutions and act and scale. And I know we always talk about that in the industry, but I don't think we're going to get away with piecemealing this. I think it's just too serious. The window is closing, the canary's in the coal mine, and we just need to start to act now. And so I'm really excited to talk about this subject, and I think this panel is really helpful in shedding light on these issues.
Okay, thanks, Cara. We'll take up this collaboration question and scale in when we do a round. Maureen, your reactions.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And it was fascinating listening to everyone and different perspectives. I think sitting in Bangladesh, which is one of the most, which is the second largest, apparently, producer in the world, and one of the top 10 top climate impacted countries in the world, which is going to produce 10 million climate refugees between now and 2030. And when I open the newspaper, I see 200 businesses are lining up for LEED certification. And when I was looking at that, and that's around the time we got your paper, Jason, and I was asking myself, what does it really mean for these businesses spending millions of dollars and investment into something that may or may not exist? The fact that 55% of the factories, as per the paper and the modeling that's been done, be it in Vietnam or Bangladesh, will be underwater in a matter of 9 years, is not a buyer issue. I agree with Cara. It's not a buyer issue. It's not a government issue. It's not a worker issue. It is an existential crisis for us. This is an opportunity where It's no longer a choice. It's a survival tactic whereby we need to climate proof our jobs, our businesses, and that conversation is not happening fast enough. Sitting in Bangladesh, we try to bring in labor actors, climate actors, and gender actors together to see, okay, is there potential for collective movement building? Because that is what's needed now. It's no longer that, oh, this is a labor issue, this is a climate issue. We just need to, I don't know, put our heads together and see, because at the apex of all this is the power imbalance. It's those who hold the maximum amount of power, yield and exercise that power over those who are paying in terms of their livelihoods and in climate impacted communities. And I think we need to do something about that. And one of the things is ownership of the problem as a whole, and also collective movements. Now is the time, better as any. And secondly, I think what I really liked, and everyone picked up on it, is regulation. And I think, you know, there's a saying, right? If we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think one of the things we've learned, and time and again, be it Rana Plaza or other defining moments or the pandemic, that we still find ourselves saying time and again is a proof point that voluntary mechanisms have not worked, because those who are going to do the right things are going to do the right things anyways. What we need is mandatory legislation, and it is encouraging to see that the pendulum is swinging in that direction, be it MHRDD or be it the US Tariff Act. It is an equalizer that's needed to shock the system to make sure that it is a level playing field, and we need to move towards that and start building on that momentum. And critical to that momentum, and something that you said, Jason, is access to data is critical. And you said access to data in a form that's accessible, that's understandable, reliable is one of the tenets that we use to define transparency in Laudes Foundation. And most importantly, making that data available to workers and the advocates who represent them in a way that they can use it for negotiation purposes and claiming their rights, because we have to change the narrative from just, you know, doing the bare minimum and you know, aiming for the lowest common denominator. We need to keep continually raising the bar. And that's where the power of data and publicly disclosed information can play a critical role. So these are the two pieces that, for me, that were particularly resonating. Thanks.
Thank you, Maureen. So what I thought we'd do now is pick up a couple of the things you've talked about and shape them into a question that each of you can respond to. This problem of power just doesn't go away, and it's more. It seems to me more urgent now on questions of climate change. But in the past, we've talked about power imbalances and how they get in the way of meaningful progress on wages, for example. So let's try this out as our first question to kick around. It's got two parts. So when we look at brand collaboration, brands just sort of working largely by themselves, that's one form of private regulation. And as Anannya said, there's a movement towards global bargaining by unions with buyers and suppliers, another form of private regulation, but accompanied by new rules, new formulas. The big question is how, given that we've been trying to make these forms of private regulation work on a large scale for 10 or 20 years, how now can, on one hand, workers and unions make that jump? So maybe first to Anannya, could you talk a little bit about what global bargaining looks like? How do you conceive it? Are there examples of it? And what changes in power relationships would be required to get workers and unions and campaigners into a bargaining relationship with buyers and suppliers, their employers? So that's one part of the question. And then maybe for Arianna, you could talk about how public regulation, we talked about changes in the Tariff Act, the forthcoming rules from the European Union on due diligence and even legal liability. How might those changes in the rules sort of even things up for workers and suppliers? If we think about the industry as a hierarchy with global buyers at the top, suppliers, and then workers. So let's start with that question. Anannya, do you want to take a crack at that first? How do workers and unions make this make this jump across this power gap?
Yes, certainly. Before I get to the unions, however, I would like to say that, you know, the climate issue and the environmental issues that are tied to the garment industry are often, and your paper has raised very, very important issues. And as we also know, the garment industry's own practices are highly, you know, destructive to the environment. What I would like to add here is that we believe that poor labor conditions is also contributing to the destruction of the planet. By that, what I mean is that the whole fashion, the model of the fast fashion industry, the way it has grown based on overproduction and overconsumption, based on extremely low wages, is not a sustainable business. I think we all agree on that, but I think we don't necessarily tie it to the environment issue, and we set aside wages as an economic and labor issue, and we don't tie it to environmental issues. So I just want to say that for us, living wages is something that will make production more sustainable, not just for labor and people, but also for the planet. In terms of scaling up, well, from the brand side, one of the things that your paper has shown is that labor compliance is not seen as an indicator for, say, the sourcing department. It's not considered as a successful indicator of business. And that has to change. So from the brand side, the brands coming together for bargaining is certainly the way to go, so that we don't go brand by brand. It's an industrial model. But also brands foregrounding labor compliance as a factor for compensation of their senior employers, their sourcing staff, and so on and so forth. That I thought was a really good recommendation that you all had. From the union point of view, the way we look at the global bargaining, in Asia Floor Wage Alliance, we look at bargaining a little bit differently from what is the more conventional way of doing global bargaining. We are very much in support of global framework agreements, which global unions practice and which are really important. However, we believe that some of these frameworks have a voluntary nature to them, and they're not concrete enough and really do not mobilize the unions at the local level. Again, I'm talking only about the garment sector. Let's be clear about that. They're not mobilizing and really making the commitment of both the brands. You know, it's still a very much a voluntary framework. And the way we look at bargaining is, first of all, the global, an agreement would be signed globally, but it is really implemented through binding agreements at the national level. So in other words, the primary unions at the local level are the real people who know what is going on, and they have to be given a very significant role in this commitment that binds unions to suppliers, to brands. So in other words, if we have a global framework agreement that is engineered in, say, Brussels or Geneva, and then passed down to, you know, local unions to do with, you know, what you can, is not the model that is working best at this point. So what we would advocate for is both bottom up and top down. In other words, agreements that are crafted through inputs from local unions, and then of course globally crafted and signed and so on, and then go back down again for their implementation, which gives ownership to the local workplace, the local union, the local supplier, and so on. And that is the way we look at binding and enforceable agreements, which is really the way to go, in our opinion, be it living wages, be it global, be it ending gender-based violence in garment factories. Any issue you take, this is the way we would go. Yeah.
Thanks, Anannya. Arianna, I want to put this to you. I mean, obviously, organizing and bargaining is central to the ILO's purpose, but in apparel, there's just not a lot of it. And I wonder if the changes that you see coming in trade policy and trade agreements, in the proposed human rights due diligence directive in the European Union, if you see something that will strengthen the hand of workers and generate more bargaining, is there something in the sort of perfect storm that Cara was describing that's going to make this likelier now than it's been in the last decade or two?
Yeah, and I think Maureen also mentioned this in her comment before. I mean, I think there is an opportunity that comes from labor provisions in trade agreements or from the mandatory human rights due diligence. These are constructs that are setting up to be a good entry point for stronger public regulation. And I think here we probably all agree that's a good thing. So there is a potential for them to become an opportunity to level the playing field. But I think connecting back to what Anannya was just saying, I think these efforts will still raise questions unless they are really anchored at the local level, and they are anchored in inclusive dialogue among all the local actors that regulate labor at the local level. So I think it's. I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic, because I think it's actually really exciting that there is such a momentum to recognizing more explicitly the role of trade, the role of brands, and the role of multinational enterprises in really like being more proactive in regulating conditions in global supply chains. I think that's a very exciting development. But I would just caution to take it with a grain of salt when it comes to really the on-the-ground implementation and the on-the-ground impact. I think can only be sustainable and meaningful if it is taken on by local dialogue. And that's then linked to the question you just asked about unionization and representation in the garment industry. And it also goes back to my remark earlier on that has to do with just providing agency and empowerment to workers that are often marginalized also in this type of dialogue. So I think it's a very concerted effort that needs to be thought about when we think about the actual effectiveness of these potential developments at the global level. So not to sound like I'm not welcoming this, but I think it is more complex than just agreeing at the global level on a very nice institutional framework. We've seen this also, in the past when in 2011, when the UN guiding principles were finally agreed upon, there was again like a big watershed moment of feeling that there is now an acknowledged and embraced framework to protect human rights in global supply chains. But it still poses a lot of questions on how those principles are translated in the reality on the ground of the everyday challenges that workers and businesses face at the local level. So I think it's a more nuanced picture. And I think it needs to be paired with capacity building efforts and with the recognition that it's often a combination of different factors and different initiatives and policies that leads to meaningful improvements.
Okay, thank you. Reactions to that or other things to add, Maureen, Cara?
I think one of the things I might want to add to Arianna's point is I think we need to start moving. And I'm going to say this, that's going to be my theme throughout. I think we need to hone in deeper and identify the incentives for accountability. The incentives can be a fear factor or it can be better exposure, but I think identifying the levers or the sticks that we can use, because UNGPs it's on a spectrum, right? UNGPs were voluntary, but as we're moving towards these legislative changes, be it US tariff act, the trade agreements that's happening, we also see proof points of changes occurring. The fact that Vietnam's used has labor provisions in their new agreement is a step in the right direction. How that plays out will be a different story. But I think we need to keep pushing the envelope as much as we can, because otherwise there will be a natural tendency to settle for the most comfortable, lowest common denominator.
I wanted to, just really quick, wanted to mention that I so agree about the binding agreements, but having experience in that area, and I'm seeing that, you know, a lot of the problem are these small brands that don't have the employees, the staff, the experience to join a binding agreement. And while I think that is a key ingredient to solve for some of these issues, we need to figure out what's the best way to bring in everyone, you know, small, medium, and large enterprises. And it's holding us back because that's like half of the industry right there. So just a comment on that.
Before we jump to the next question, just an ad for our project's next paper. It's focused on global bargaining. It starts with this question of global severance fund. How might it be built, and what are the existing models for bargaining at the national and global levels? And we use the model of the ITF and freight owners. Now that industry looks nothing like apparel, but the bones of a global agreement are there anyway. That'll be coming out in the next month or so. I want to pick up on something Cara just talked about, smaller brands, and talk too about smaller suppliers. As we were writing this paper and focusing on the top 10, the top 20, the largest suppliers, the largest production centers, I got the feeling that there was a whole lot out there that wasn't getting picked up. It is never touched by the world of whether public or private regulation, and all that production. It was estimated to be at about 80% of the global apparel trade by one of a longtime observer of the industry. Just doesn't get a look. So we spend our time talking about Nike and H&M and Inditex and dozens, a good 24 others, but there's arguably 80% of production that just doesn't get a look. So I'm interested in them. What happens at that end, the long tail of the apparel industry, where workers get little consideration, where suppliers see little regulation, and buyers just don't get attention from campaigners, unions, and regulators at home. Any thoughts on the rest of the industry, and how, as we talk about improving working conditions, we get them into the picture?
Yes, it is. Gosh, that's the tough question, because I've interacted with a lot of small brands out there, and there's some small brands, by the way, that are doing amazing things. I mean, even profit sharing with suppliers and things like that. It's very few, but there's some amazing things going on out there. But the majority of them, there's some big brands in there too, not just small and medium, that they're just starting out. They might have a small program or no program. And, their suppliers are not looked at all. In fact, they go through agents. And, I think the only answer to that is there's got to be some legislation that brings everyone into the fold. And like Maureen said, a shock to the system. There needs to be something. I mean, here's an example, and it didn't include small apparel brands, but the SB 657 for, California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, for any company that made over $100 million annually, you had to disclose what you were doing to prevent human trafficking in your supply chain, and you have to post it on your website. It was a very clever law because you didn't really have to do anything, but nobody wants to post that they're doing nothing. So this law was very important to get some of those smaller brands, at least the ones over 100 grand or 100 million, to act on forced labor and human trafficking. And so there's already an example in the industry of how legislation can help there. Am I an advocate to legislate everything? Absolutely not. But there has got to be enough of it to move everyone, all actors, to do the right thing here. And until we get those smaller brands on board, it's going to be really hard to, mitigate any of the issues that are outlined in the paper.
Maureen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just build on something Cara said. I think what we need to start working towards is these smaller, I would say it's smaller brands, but these entities that engage in unscrupulous business activities, that they have no safe haven. And we have examples of that because the industry has proven itself time and again that it's very good at transferring the problem. One region gets particularly strict with labor conditions or environmental conditions, they move their business elsewhere. But what we see happening right now with the US Tariff Act is similar legislative changes against forced labor is being taken up in other jurisdictions. Australian Parliament is taking it up, Canada is looking at its own version, Japan's taking its own version. So it's one of the rare instances of a race to the top in the industry. And this is where we need to really start doubling our efforts so that we can support the organizations and the advocates who are pushing for these in their members, these kinds of changes in the member states, and also making sure that we provide the necessary training, resources on the background to the grassroots-based organizations representing the workers so that they can use these systems that are there for them, because it's really critical. And I'll say this, supply chain transparency, I'm not saying is the magic bullet, but it's a step in the right direction. Again, I'll use Bangladesh as an example. Despite having the worst industrial accident in recent, century, it took us a while to map the entire industry. Laudes Foundation, along with a few strategic partners, have built something called Mapped in Bangladesh, which is an interactive map of majority of the factories in Bangladesh. But it shouldn't have taken this long. As the second largest apparel producing in the world, we cannot afford to have this kind of opacity. And this should be taken as a given. So I think, again, transparency and publicly disclosed data in a way that's accessible, available in national language that workers can use to hold their governments and businesses to account. It's something what Anannya said, we need the bottom-up and the top-down approach, because we need to provide the necessary data and the tools with the workers in these factories of the 80% opaque side, with the resources with which they can push back, and also make sure that we are safeguarding them as well. It's kind of a critical piece of the puzzle. So.
Thanks, Maureen. Before we jump to the scenarios, any thoughts on that, Arianna or Anannya?
Well, as one of the few trade unionists in my country, and also just generally, after 30 years of, fighting for justice, my general rule of thumb is, size doesn't matter as much as strategic, action. So I always find that change is brought about by visionaries and people who take strategic action at the right time. Change is never brought about by who is the biggest. So just saying that.
Good. Arianna, anything before we go to scenarios? You're not obligated.
No, I think I will save my comments for the scenarios. Thank you.
All right. So we've got a quarter an hour or so left. I'm going to dash through the scenarios that conclude the paper. And then we'll take a quick poll to sort of take the temperature of all of you out there. And then we'll react to those and wrap up. I see a couple of questions. If you've got other questions you want to put, we'll maybe roll them up and put them to the panelists before we close. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so the paper ends with three scenarios. Having looked way back at the history of the apparel industry over the last 20, 30 years, with a focus on what the data tells us about the industry's shape and the trajectories along which it moves, we wanted to look ahead. So we crafted three scenarios, and the first was sort of the default. So in the post-COVID era, the industry will revert to the norm, and we called this scenario repeat. It goes back to what's familiar. And on the screen there, I've pulled a couple of lines from the description of that scenario in the paper. And the word that, if I had to pick one word to describe it, it would be to characterize that scenario, it would be stroll. The pace of internal change in the industry reverts in the post-pandemic period to the familiar stroll. That means that it's leisurely, unhurried. The second scenario is regain. So a little further along this spectrum, there are changes to the industry structure and sourcing habits that are accelerating. The paper describes some of those in detail. But changes in governance, and that's a shorthand for changes in the power relationships, are driven by outsiders. Anannya talked, for example, about bargaining at the global level and from the ground up, are merely accommodated. That is, the largest brands, either by dint of their approach to the problem or on account of the pressures they're suffering, accommodate campaigns and unions where they have to. And the third is renegotiate. We talked in the paper about partnership and what that looks like. And partnership in this scenario means a partnership between buyers and their suppliers, which is increasingly the norm, particularly at the top end of the industry. But partnership also with fashion's outsiders, smaller suppliers, workers and their organizations, regulators, consumers. And that partnership writes into contracts. And they negotiate terms and write into contracts what it is the industry will do and change. And I think, as someone in the panel said, how risk and cost gets redistributed along a supply chain. And as I was writing the renegotiate scenario, and assuming this is where many of us who watch or work in the industry want things to head, I wondered, why would powerful brands and retailers do this? Why would they submit to negotiation of terms when they've been able to avoid this successfully over the last 30 years? And I thought there are three things that are possibly driving them towards this. One is public regulation, or change in the balance between public and private, with public regulation including due diligence, trade restrictions, and legal liability, forcing brands into a new position. Second, we haven't talked about this, but investor anxiety, real anxiety among some investors about how little they know about the apparel industry. Some of them are as in the dark as we are as researchers or outsiders, even some insiders, as much in the dark as we are about what's happening along global supply chains. And the anxiety is born of the changes in public regulation, which will put a real premium on knowing what's happening out there and managing that risk. And then third, the integration of campaigns and across the globe, and consumer pressure, which for the first time begins to feel more real. We've watched polling over 20 years suggesting that customers will pay more for a t-shirt made under these conditions. But the sales figures don't bear that out. That appears to be changing, and a younger generation of consumers are making social sustainability and environmental sustainability a part of their purchase calculus. Okay, so I'm sort of putting my thumb on the scale here, but I wonder which of these, so we've got a couple of poll questions, and I'll ask Allison to put them up, and then we'll get your reactions to them. The first is, which of these three scenarios is the likeliest? What do you think is going to happen? And then the second question, on a 1 to 100 scale, rate the appetite amongst leading apparel brands and retailers for a renegotiate scenario. If that's the one that we think is, I'm projecting, if that's the one we think is the most appealing or progressive, do we think brands are gonna go for it? What's the strength of their appetite? And then a third question, not up here, is if you had to come up with a fourth scenario, not repeat, regain, or renegotiate, but something else fitting in between one of those or at either extreme, what would it be? What would you call it? You can drop that into the chat. Claire has posted the question there. Okay, so let's take a minute and get all the answers in, and then we'll react to it and figure out what it all means. I think a question from Richard Lloyd in the chat about the time scale for these, for another scenario. I think when we started writing the paper, before COVID really took hold, the thinking was this might be a 20-year long view, but COVID seems to have accelerated all of that, and I think we can probably think 5 to 10 years for a time scale. All right, replies still coming in. Which of these scenarios is likeliest? Repeat is beating out the rest at about 50%. All right, folks, get your votes in. We're going to close it in a minute. And then I'll ask panelists to react to what the poll says and to tell us, give us their answers to these three questions. Okay, I think that's about everybody. Okay, so the results are, which of these is likeliest? Repeat at 50%, regain 35%, renegotiate, core renegotiate at 15%. And on a 100 scale, what's the appetite amongst leading brands and retailers for that last scenario, the renegotiate scenario? The largest number comes in 20 to 30, 30 to 40. So between 20 or 40. I see one yes at the bottom of the scale, 1 to 10, and I see 0 at the 90 to 100, but a smattering of 50s to 80s and 90s for renegotiate. Okay, I'm going to pull that down. Thank you, Allison. Okay, let's have your answers to those questions, those two questions, and your reactions to the poll. Any surprises, Maureen?
I'm digesting. I'm trying to figure out the poll. I'm not surprised. I mean, and that's why at the beginning, I think the fact that we're all here and you have, 350 audience members, I think we want to see the systems change. We really, the fact that we're all here is we don't want to go back to a repeat scenario. It hasn't done anything for anyone. So I honestly think that, how can we speak truth to power and start building the pressure points and the levers that's going to help us move towards the third scenario. So I think that's it's going back to repeat. It's just sad and depressing.
Arianna?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely second the sadness of going back to repeat. And I am more optimistic than our audience in terms of the likability of it, because I think COVID-19 has been a big test for the supply chain, even if we don't take labor into account. But just looking at the business side, I think it's been a big cold shower to realize that this supply chain is just not sustainable. It's not the way it's supposed to be organized, even if we don't even look at workers. So I really doubt that the consensus will be, yeah, let's just go back to what we were doing because it worked so well when we had a shock. So I think a rethink will be there, whether it will be the progressive kind of deliberate rethink that we hope. And I see a lot of nice suggestions in the chat box that are very inspiring, like reset, reboot, reimagine. That's what we all would look for. From my side, and again, reading the paper, I think a concern that I have that is about what I think is a likely scenario that we should try to avoid is for regain to take more hold. There is a bit of a middle ground where there is a bifurcation of outcomes and a kind of good outcome for the lucky few that are in first-tier suppliers that are linked to those big brand names that have big reputations and are indeed going to make efforts to be more responsible, to implement meaningfully a mandatory due diligence if it does take place, et cetera, and the disconnect with the vast majority of the industry being further away than it even is now in terms of outcomes. And I think that's, for me, something, a bit of a sobering approach. And I say it also from the perspective of Better Work, which is a program that mostly works with those first-tier suppliers. And despite all the very good results that we can prove and the meaningful impact that we have on workers' lives that are in those factories, I think we are all concerned about leaving behind the most vulnerable, which has been really the thread of my own remarks today. And I think that, for me, is a likely but very undesirable outcome. And therefore, it's where I think a lot of the proactive attention when it comes to giving voice to the most vulnerable and finding ways to renegotiate more effectively the power imbalance that exists should really come into place and should be really strengthened at the very core. So, so I think it's not just a question of speed of change, but it's a question of equity of change, and what we hope to see a much more equitable outcome for all involved.
Thank you, Arianna. Others? Anannya, Cara, Maureen? We've got just a few minutes, so keep it.
Yeah, sure. I see some good reads there. I think reclaim, I love reclaim. That's what we are trying to do. So reclaim to reset and reimagine. I'm optimistic. I cannot do my work without optimism. So I have faith, and I don't think that the biggest players out there have to make the changes. I think if we put our heads together, the strategic view, and take the action, I believe that we can lead the way for renegotiation by reclaiming the path. So yes.
2 steps. Maureen or Cara?
Sure. Well, one is I think we have to be optimistic. I think we have to think about what we want and not what we don't want to make that happen. So I am going with the last option, but I'm not surprised on the polling results. And also on the flip side is, the shocks that are happening are just going to keep happening. Again, this is the new normal. And business, CSR teams, suppliers, CSOs, we all know this is ridiculous. It's the definition of crazy. We just can't keep doing what we're doing. So, and I think with the onslaught that's coming on climate shocks as well, we're going to have no choice. So I think the last option is the only option.
Maureen?
I think it's lovely to be in a room full of optimists. I think it's brilliant. It's very easy to say that, okay, we're just going to repeat. I think I love what someone said here. It's renegotiate. I think it's a question of pushing back and pushing back against the power imbalance that defines, be it inequality or climate breakdown. It all kind of culminates in power imbalances and breaking those molds. I think one of the ways to do it is through creating the tools for better movement building and collective action. And I think this is a step in the right direction. It's bringing everyone together to identify what are the common risks, threats, and what binds us, be it climate, be it labor. Climate justice is labor justice. It's all intertwined. So in my head, let's just renegotiate.
All right. Well, some good ones in the chat. I like reclaim. I like revalue. As a researcher, I like reassess. One of the next projects we hope for the New Conversations project is a deeper dive on this set of questions, and in particular this nexus between climate breakdown or climate shocks and impacts on workers and suppliers. There's a lot more work to do there. As you see, if you read the paper, what we've provided is a very high level look at what's happening nationally, but there's a lot yet to figure out before we get to strategies and negotiation. We're almost out of time. Well, we're right at the limit. So I wanted to ask briefly, I know this isn't fair for our panelists, but I want to ask them if they could pick out one of the most urgent or important changes to call for in the industry. What would it be? If you were putting all your eggs in one basket, what would that basket say?
We need a multi-sector collaboration approach. I mean, I'm hearing a collective groan, another group, but honestly, nobody can do this alone. It's too huge. So, my call to action would be we need to come together as an industry and multiple industries to solve for the problems that workers are facing.
Interesting. Arianna? Anannya?
Yeah, I would say redistributed and more equitable global supply chain. Right now, the value of the global supply chain is going from production country to the brand's home countries for the most part. And so a redistributive element which brings the value back to the production countries, which is subsidizing the brands. So I would call it a redistributed and more equitable global supply chain.
Another read. Arianna?
Yeah, I don't know if I can come up with another but I will say it has to be about having everybody around the table and not assuming that global actors can figure it all out without including really like producing country governance and local actors as meaningful partners.
Maureen?
Yeah, I think for me, I would put all the eggs in the mandatory basket. I see it as a democratization tool, and we just need to move pendulum further and further towards mandatory changes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're at the limit here. I didn't know as I was putting this panel together that we'd have 4 optimists, and so in tension with the audience, which doesn't share all of that. Okay. Thanks to those in the audience, and particularly Jos, who's been dropping in questions and thoughts. Thank you for joining us today. We're sorry we ran a little late, and thank you to our panelists. It's been wonderful to have you on and to argue about this. When we get to the next one, whether that be severance or another look at climate and workers, we'll bring you back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.